This is the Fujifilm XF16-55 f2.8 zoom lens, one of the first zoom lenses that Fujifilm put out for the X system, and it's not a lens that I've ever really used much, nor one that I thought I'd ever do a review of, because I tend to not use mid-range zooms that much in my work. Now, I'm a landscape photographer and I tend to prefer to work with wider focal lengths, something like the 10-24, or with the telephoto focal length, something like the 55-200 or the 50-140. But I've heard so many good things about this lens. It's a lens that people seem to love, they constantly rave about, and it gets used a lot. So I thought that I would give it a try for this trip, for the last trip that I did to the Dolomites. And looking at a lot of the shots that I do there, I thought actually it would probably work quite well for that trip. So I took it along to see how useful and how good it was for me as a lens for landscape photography in the mountains. Now, the first thing to talk about is the build quality. It's one of Fuji's red badge lenses, which marks out the top quality lenses like the 100-400 or the 50-140, and the build quality of this is exceptional. Generally, all Fuji lenses are incredibly well made, but this actually feels like a level above. It's bigger and heavier than the 10-24. It's an all metal construction. It really does have a bit of weight to it, and it does feel very solid, really satisfying to use. The rings are extremely good. This is obviously, it's not a new lens. I borrowed this from Fuji, so it's about 4 or 5 years old and has been used a lot. But the zoom is still nice and tight. I didn't really notice any zoom creep at all with it. The focus ring is really nice and tight, and the aperture ring is really lovely. It's got a really nice resistance, a really solid clicking, and it really feels really satisfying to work with the aperture of this. It's also weather sealed, which makes it gives you a little bit more peace of mind to use when you're shooting in bad conditions, if you're near waterfalls, or if it's spitting it down with rain, or if you're shooting in dusty conditions. Having the weather sealing does give you that, like I said, that little bit of extra peace of mind. Although it has to be said, I use a lot of Fuji lenses that are not classed as weather sealed, things like the original 10-24 or the 55-200, and I've been using those for years and never had any problem with them. So generally Fuji lenses are super high quality, but as I said, this does really feel like a little bit of a cut above. It's a little bit disappointing for me that the zoom isn't internal, that the zoom extends, but I guess if you did have an internal zoom, it's going to make it even bigger and heavier, which isn't ideal for landscape photography when you don't want to have a big heavy weight in your pack. But you can see it is quite a lot larger than something like the 18-55 kit lens, and it's quite a bit bigger than something like the 16-80. Now, that extra weight isn't just about the build quality, it also comes down to the fact that this is an f2.8 aperture lens. It's f2.8 consistent all the way through the range from 16 at one end to 55 at the other, and that does make it bigger and heavier. Now, from a landscape perspective, f2.8 isn't really essential. I almost never shoot landscapes at f2.8. The exception to that would be if I'm shooting astro, or if I'm shooting the aurora or something like that. And if I were doing that, 16 millimeters, it isn't really wide enough. When you're shooting astro, when you're shooting the aurora, you need to get a lot of the sky in the frame. And it also helps composition to have something in the ground to give context to the sky. And to do that, I generally find you need something around 12 millimeters or wider. So 16 millimeters, it's not great, it's not ideal for shooting astro, but it is something that you can use in a pinch, and it is nice to have. However, that f2.8 does add a fair bit of weight and a fair bit of bulk to the lens, and that has to be balanced against the rest of your kit, the other lenses that you're carrying, the other things that you're taking with you. Because if you're like me and you're shooting landscapes and you tend to hike a lot, then this is all weight that has to go on your back. Now, I didn't actually find it too bad, and this last trip we were doing some quite long hikes, mostly at altitude at about 2,500 meters. We did hikes like we were often out for 2, 3, 4 hours with our packs on our backs, walking for 10, 15 kilometers with some elevation gain. And I never really found the weight of this was excessive. It never really weighed me down like the 100-400. I really noticed that in my pack when I was using that in Iceland. But it probably would be nicer to have something a little bit lighter, something like the 16-80, which does weigh a fair bit less. Now, in terms of the focal length, as I said before, I tend to not use mid-range zooms that often in my work. I have the 18-55, but I almost never have it in my bag. And that's mostly because I prefer shooting wide angle or telephotos to isolate a little bit of the scene. I find that the mid-range is less interesting to me. I can't create dynamic images as much as I would like to. I can't really get the different layers of the landscape. If I'm shooting a scene with a mountain in it and I want some of the sky, then sometimes it can be hard to fit foreground in there as well. The frame feels a little bit cramped at 16. So it's not a lens that I've ever really been that interested in, but I thought about it for this trip because I've been to the Dolomites many times, and I do find that it's a particular location where I tend to not shoot ultra wide that often, and I do tend to shoot a lot at the telephoto end, around the 55 end. So I thought that I could actually make use of this. And as it turned out, I did use this a lot. A lot of the wide angles that I was shooting, 16 was wide enough for me. And at the other end, at the 55 end, because a lot of the telephoto landscapes that I do are around the 50-55, I found that I could just keep this one lens on my camera all the time and shoot a lot of my telephoto shots with this lens rather than the 55-200. So because of that, whereas usually on a typical trip, I'll be about 50-50 between the wide angle zoom and the telephoto zoom, I actually use this for about 2/3 of the shots that I did. So it shows that, what do I know, it is actually a really useful lens. I did find that there were occasions when it wasn't wide enough, and for that I used the 9mm Laowa, and I used that quite a bit actually, because I do really like wide angle shots. And this doesn't give you that ultra wide feel. And in terms of telephoto, 55, it's great for quite a lot of shots, but I did quite often want something a little bit more. So something like the 16-80 is probably a better focal range for a mid-range zoom for my particular uses. Now, one thing that this lens does lack, which is quite strange, is OIS, optical image stabilization, which even Fuji's kit lens, the 18-55, has. And I think that's partly to do with the fact that it's such an old lens. But it is something that is a bit of an oversight. It is something that misses a little bit, particularly because at 55, at the long end, it is a telephoto lens. And when you're shooting handheld at something like 55, image stabilization really does help a lot to avoid getting vibrations and image shake. Now with Fuji's newer cameras, with things like the X-T4 or with the XS10 or even something like the XH1, which have image stabilization, I don't think this is much of an issue. I was shooting with the X-T4 and XS10 in the Dolomites. I did a lot of handheld shots with this at 55mm, and the stabilization in the camera really did help, and I wasn't particularly worried about getting camera shake. However, if you're using one of Fuji's older cameras, something like the X-T3 or the X-T30 or one of the X Pro line, then camera shake is going to be more of an issue, and the lack of OIS is probably going to be something that you may miss. I suspect that this lens may get some renewal in the next couple of years and we'll get an OIS version, but for now this is what we've got, and it's not a game changer for me. I don't think it kills the lens. I think the lens is still super effective without it, particularly because you can reduce the aperture to f2.8, but it is a noticeable omission on this particular lens. Now when it comes to image quality, I'm not someone who zooms into 300% into images. I'm not really a pixel peeper. And this review isn't going to be about comparing sharpness charts or photographing brick walls or anything like that. What I care about is that when I'm shooting landscapes at something like f7.1 or f8 through to f11, which is the aperture where lenses tend to perform best and where I shoot most of my landscapes, I want to know that the lens is going to give me a sharp image from the center into the borders and into the corners at most of the focal length. So that's what I care about, and that's what I'm going to look at when I talk about the sharpness and the optical performance of this lens.
So what I want to do to have a look at the quality of the lens is to compare it with the 16-80, which a colleague of mine was using at the same time. So I shot the scene with the same conditions, with the exact same settings on the camera through different focal lengths, at the widest at 16, in the middle, and then at the telephoto of 55. I've always shot it in the middle of the aperture range at f.8. I'm not really interested in looking at wide open at f2.8 because I simply never shoot landscapes with the lens wide open, nor with the aperture smaller than f13, because you start to get diffraction. I always shoot in the middle of the aperture range, because that's where basically the lens performs best. And so what I wanted to do is just to get an idea of how this lens performs in a landscape, in a typical landscape shooting the way that I normally would. So here you can see the two lenses. There's the 16-55 on the left and the 16-80 on the right. So let's just zoom in a little bit and have a look at the detail here. Now straight away you can see that the 16-80, it's a more contrasty lens. The darks are darker, the brights are a little bit brighter, and that kind of contrast gives the lens a little bit more punch. It makes it feel like it's got more detail, but that's not necessarily the case. It's not necessarily resolving more detail. I can't really see much of a difference here in the rocks in the center. They both look very similar. As we go down into the corner, I think that in the 16-55, you can see here that this tree has got a little bit more detail. But there's really not a huge amount of difference. I think sort of down here in the corner with these bushes, again, you can see that the 16-55 has got a little bit more detail. It's resolving a little bit more. But there's not really a huge amount of difference. So now in the middle of the focal length at about 33 millimeters, again, the 16-55 on the left and the 16-80 on the right. And you can see the same exposure settings. So let's zoom in a little bit to look at the detail in the cliff face. Again, the 16-80, it's more contrasty, it's a bit more punchy. But I think when you look in the center, the 16-55 is resolving a little bit more detail. I think we can see here more in this fine detail up at the top here, whereas here this starts to look a little bit more smeared. I don't know how much that's going to show with YouTube compression. When we go down into the detail in these rocks here, again, they're very similar. 16-80 is a surprisingly good lens, but I think there's a slightly more detail here in these trees. The detail here is tiny bit more smeared, but it's really not that different. And now we're at the telephoto end of the zoom range at 55 millimeters. So you can see again with the 16-55 on the left. If we zoom in a little bit, I think here there's a little bit more of a difference. I think the detail here again looks a little bit more smeared, but the performance of both lenses is excellent. And the 16-55, I've been really impressed with it. When I've been editing the images, the amount of detail really does seem to be nice, particularly when I start to play with the image, when I edit the raw files, when I put a little bit of sharpness in there. If we look down into the bottom here, into the corners, very similar again, but I do think that when I look at these trees or the detail around these rocks, there's just a little bit more detail being resolved in the 16-55 than the 16-80. Although the 16-80 does have that punchy, slightly higher contrast look. So now what I'd like to do is to compare the 16-55 with the 55-200 at the 55 millimeter, because as I said earlier in the review, I tended to use the 16-55 more when I was shooting at 55 because it meant that I didn't have to change lenses. So I used the 55-200 a lot less than I normally would because that's the focal length that I tend to do a lot of my shots at. Now, I've generally been really happy with the 55-200. I think it's a very, very good lens. So I'm curious to see how they compare. And when we zoom in here, again, you can see that the 55-200, it's a little bit more high contrast. And it really does look to me a little bit as though it's resolving slightly more detail. I don't know if that's because the 16-55 is at the end of the telephoto range where zooms tend to perform, where the performance tends to drop off, whereas the 55-200 is probably in a more of its sweet spot in terms of performance. But there's really not a huge amount of difference. This is a really nice lens, the 16-55. The fact that it's kept this level of sharpness all the way through the focal length that I'm seeing here is really quite impressive. But there's not a huge amount of detail you can see when we look at these trees and these rocks in the borders. Now I just want to do a few comparisons with the 18-55 with the kit lens. I didn't actually have that lens with me when I was in the Dolomites, so the shots that I did here I had to do back home basically of the house across the street from me. So this is at the widest focal length. This is at 18. So let's just zoom in right into the center here. And here, I think the difference is more significant than when comparing it with the 16-80. There does seem to be quite a bit more detail here when we look around the railings. the 18-55 isn't really quite sharp. Let's have a look at some of this cabling down here. And there's just a little bit more, I don't know, sharpness. It just seems to resolve with a little bit more clarity when we look at the high detailing area around these cables and this door. Let's go into the corner here, some more cabling here, some more high detail areas. And I think that the difference starts to be a little bit more noticeable, particularly when we look down here into the paving stones, where these stones here are slightly more resolved than these, which start to look a little bit blurry and smeary. And now we're in the middle of the focal length at about 33 millimeters. Let's just zoom in again, have a look at the detail in the tiles. Now again, I think straight away around the railing here, you can see a little bit more detail. And it's a significantly more expensive lens, the 18-55. It's just a kit lens, but it does have a good reputation, and it's a lens that I used to carry with me just in case I ever needed those middle focal lengths. But I was never as inclined to use it as I am with the 16-55. That was a lens that I always felt, really happy to leave on the camera, whereas the 18-55 lens was one that I would just basically use in a pinch. I think when we look at the cabling around here in the corners, you can see a fair bit of difference, a fair bit of drop off in quality with the 18-55, but it is still a very good lens. And now the final comparison at the telephoto end at 55 millimeters. Let's just zoom in and have a look in the center. Not a huge amount of difference in the center. I think when we look at this sign here, the writing here is a little bit more legible than the printing on that door. But then when we get up into that, I think also this framing here has a little bit more resolution. When we get up into the corners here, look at the cabling and the detail around these boxes. It's just a little bit more clarity, particularly when we look at the fine detail here around these white cables. This here looks a tiny bit blurred, a little bit smeared. And just overall, the 16-55 is a better lens. Now, the difference isn't huge. As I said, I've been shooting right in the middle of the aperture range, where all lenses tend to perform at their best, and that's where I shoot landscapes. And there's not a massive step up between the 16-55 and the 16-80. There's a bigger jump between the 18-55. But it is a better quality lens, and certainly if you were using it right across the aperture range at f2.8, then I think you'd notice more differences. But even without that, in the middle of the aperture range, then you can see the quality of the 16-55.
So overall then, this is an excellent lens. The focal range is extremely useful for landscape photography, which surprised me a lot. But at the 16mm end, you can use that a lot for wide angle landscapes. And at the other end, at the long end, 55 is great for a lot of telephoto work. Now, it's not a one lens solution for me. I did find that I often need to shoot longer than 55, and I occasionally needed to shoot wider than 16mm would allow me. So it's never going to be just the one lens in my camera bag. If you want to just have one lens, one do-it-all lens, then the 16-80 has probably a more useful focal range, but you do lose a little bit of the sharpness and performance that you get in this lens. And of course, it doesn't have the f2.8, so it can't double for an Astro lens. Is it Fuji's best mid-range zoom? For me, in terms of absolute quality, yes, certainly it is. It's an extremely good lens. Is it the most useful mid-range zoom? Well, maybe, as I said, the 16-80 has a more versatile focal length, and whether you're willing to trade that in terms of the quality that you get for this and the build, that's really up to you. It's a lens, the 16-80 is a lens I've been wanting to review for quite a while. I've been wanting to use it for quite a while, and that's something that I'm hopefully going to get hold of in a couple of months, and then I'll be able to give a much better comparison. But for now, this lens really surprised me. It's an extremely good lens, and I really enjoyed using it a lot for shooting in the mountains. And I think that's pretty much it. If there's anything I missed, if there's anything that you're not sure about, just drop me a comment or an email and I'll get back to you if you've got any questions at all. And if you enjoy my photography and you'd like to come and do a workshop with me next year, there are still a few places left on some of the Norway workshops that I'm going to be doing in the summer and in the winter. There are full details on my website, so please check that out, along with details on all the other workshops that I'll be doing next year. And over the next few months, I'm going to be launching some new trips to some incredible destinations for later next year and into the year beyond. So as ever, thanks for watching and all the support of the channel. Good luck with all your photography and take care. See ya.